Everyone relaxed?
Well.
All right. So tell me who you are, please.
So we're a team of consultants brought in by the National Cannabis Industry Association, which is the leading trade association for the legal cannabis industry in the United States, and we've been brought in to present on the ethical issues surrounding the legal cannabis industry.
Can I have your names, please?
I'm Seamus Coleman.
I'm Rex Beta. Arjun Prasad.
And I forgot to shake your hand, so I'll do that now. Welcome.
Lovely to meet you.
Welcome. Thanks. Okay. All right. You're done with your 1 minute? Then I suggest we hit.
Right. 1, 2, 3.
Yes. Mine didn't work. Wait a minute.
No.
I told you. It is the... Yes.
Okay. Is it possible for businesses to ethically sell a product that President Nixon once described as public enemy number 1? That's the question that businesses operating in the legal cannabis industry confront. This is an industry that was worth $2.7 billion in 2014 and continues to grow rapidly. We see that these businesses are in uncharted ethical waters for a number of reasons. First, because the long-term impacts of cannabis remain unclear. Second, because this remains a fragmented and fragile industry which is exposed to significant regulatory risk. And finally, because these businesses face competing legal obligations at a state and federal level. So we're going to address these uncharted ethical waters by addressing 3 questions. First, by looking at how states should resolve their competing legal obligations. Second, by taking a look at why it is ethical to support the legalised cannabis industry. And finally, by taking a look at what steps businesses should take to reconcile the potential long-term impacts of cannabis use. So turning to this legal question, and how businesses should ethically resolve their competing legal obligations. We see that under state laws in the United States, there's been a rapid trend towards legalisation, beginning with decriminalisation in the 1970s, and then moving towards the legalisation of medical marijuana use, starting with California in the 1990s, and more recently, the legalisation of recreational cannabis use as a result of ballot measures in states like Colorado, Oregon, Alaska, and Washington. We see further ballot measures planned in states like Nevada, California, and Arizona next year. But while this trend towards legalisation has been occurring, marijuana remains prohibited under federal law. Under the Controlled Substances Act, it is listed as a Schedule I drug alongside heroin and LSD, which presents businesses with an ethical dilemma. Should they comply with their federal obligations or should they comply with the state level obligations? We suggest that there's not a hard and fast rule, but a number of factors that businesses should consider when deciding what is the most ethical path forward when resolving these competing obligations. The first is recency. Unlike the Controlled Substances Act, which was passed in 1970, the ballot measures which have legalised recreational marijuana use were passed in the last 2 years. Secondly, in terms of intent, the Obama administration has made clear that it does not intend to enforce the prohibition on marijuana use in states that have legalised medical and recreational marijuana use. Given that the Obama administration has not expressed an intent to enforce this obligation, we think that's a factor that businesses should consider. Additionally, in terms of proximity, we think that businesses should err on the side of complying with those obligations passed by lawmakers most proximate to them. And so in this circumstance, cannabis businesses operating at a state level should comply with those laws relevant to their states. And finally, we think the overriding factor should be the impact on society of complying with the relevant obligation. And as we're going to explore in some detail, we think that the overall impact of complying with a legalised framework is much more preferable to complying with the criminalised framework. And that's what Arjun's going to take a look at now, is the ethics of supporting the legalised cannabis industry.
So as Seamus mentioned, the ethics behind navigating the legal framework, I'm going to look at 2 things. Basically, the ethics behind having a legalized industry and the ethics of harm minimization in this legalized industry. So first off, we're seeing that what used to prevail before in terms of criminal punishment has moved towards a softer base in terms of education and rehabilitation for individuals who consume or possess marijuana. Secondly, we've seen a more experimentative approach to reducing the harm marijuana causes in terms of THC, which used to be used before in terms of the cannabinoid, to CBD, which is a slightly softer version of it and a less harmful one. Thirdly, we've also seen that the proceeds from the sales of cannabis and cannabis-related products used to go into funding organized crime, whereas it can now be used at a broader tax base, which we feel is beneficial. And lastly, we hope and we predict that this legalization wave is going to lead to a more data-driven and scientific approach to usage patterns, to regulation, as well as education in the marijuana industry. So this is why we believe our case supports the ethics behind participating and having a legalized framework. Secondly, we'd like to look at what are the harm minimization aspects of having a legalized industry. So firstly, we see that almost half of all drug arrests as early as 2010 were because of possession of cannabis and cannabis-related products, which could have saved the government up to $3.6 billion in terms of revenue. And the negative effects of having almost 700,000 people arrested could have been significantly reduced. Secondly, we look at a broader spectrum where we look at the deaths caused due to drug wars between mafias and cartels, which could have been severely curtailed had the industry been legalized. Also, students like you and I were denied federal and financial aid at one point in time because of some kind of possession record they might have had for this drug because of the legal framework at that time. But we do realize that there is not always an upswing to the legalization and consumption of marijuana. We do recognize that there are short-term as well as long-term concerns in this area. In terms of short-term concerns, we've seen that there is immediate physiological concerns, public safety concerns, as well as the community effect that legalization has. But we do strongly believe that the short-term concerns could be significantly mitigated using regulation alone. So for example, driving under the influence of marijuana can be made illegal. And also, for example, the advertising of marijuana and cannabis-related products could be mandated in such a way that the target audience, at least 75% of the target audience, is above the age of 21. So these are just some of the things that we can do in terms of regulation for the short term. But the long-term concerns are a slightly trickier situation. And the question remains, how do we address these ambiguous long-term concerns?
So how do you as an industry address long-term concerns and long-term harms that are perhaps unknown and have an undefined timeline? Well, that's why we're suggesting a cannabis compensation fund, a fund administered by the trade body, funded by a small levy of 0.2% on revenue of all industry participants. This fund will be a compensation of last resort, so once traditional measures are unavailable, people that have been potentially harmed by the industry, especially in the longer term, can dip into this fund as part of compensation. The fund will be at the discretion of the trustees, which will be appointed by the Trade Association. We believe this fund solves the long-term issues for 5 key reasons. First, conventional methods are often unavailable, particularly as it relates to our industry. So conventional methods usually come in 2 forms of potential redress. 1 being litigation and 2 being regulation, specifically the use of the tax base. So why doesn't litigation work? Well, it doesn't always work in this case because the industry may be re-prohibited. We hope that's not the case, but that is a risk for the industry. Secondly, we see in the short to medium term, there will very likely be a lot of consolidation within the industry. What this means is that under either consolidation or re-prohibition, the players that exist in the market today may not exist in 10 years' time. And the simple fact is that these harms may manifest themselves 20, 30 years into the future, and there will not be the person directly responsible for the harm to litigate against when the harms manifest themselves. Secondly, you're probably wondering, well, why don't we just use the tax base? We're receiving a lot of sales tax from cannabis. And that is true, but quite often the tax is specified for a specific purpose as part of the ballot. So in the example of Colorado, as part of the ballot, it's specified that all tax revenues must be used on school repairs, and anything left over must be used on marijuana education. So this rules out using the tax base. Secondly, we believe that business should be responsible for any harms they cause, and that this responsibility extends beyond the life of the business, beyond the life of the corporate entity. That responsibility doesn't disappear just because the corporate entity may disappear. And we already see this today in corporate America. We see this in pension obligations. We see this in environmental responsibility to remediate sites. This already exists. Thirdly, we believe this is ethical because it is equitable. It's asking all industry participants and all people that profit from the industry to potentially mitigate some of the harms that flow from that profit. Fourthly, we believe this coincides with the precautionary principle, namely that where there are unknown long-term harms, that everything in our power should be done to mitigate potential harms, that we should go above and beyond mere regulatory compliance and go the extra mile. Finally, we believe that this creates systemic benefits, that the systemic benefits Arjun spoke about of a legalised industry vis-a-vis a black market industry are achieved while we mitigate the downside with the use of this fund. We do not want to be the next big tobacco. We want to go the extra mile and have as much harm mitigation as is possible. So what have you heard from us today? You've heard that while incredibly complex, it is possible to ethically navigate the legal framework. You've heard that participation in the legalised industry is ethical, and you've heard that we can mitigate the long-term effects with our fund. This is the only way by adopting these measures to prevent the industry going up in smoke.
And last but not least, St. Thomas. Very adept at this.
You never know what technology is coming in.
Well, you'll be fine by comparison to what I'm doing. All right, so there we're clear. So you're going to have a minute off the clock to tell me